Hey everybody, I am back with another ranking video, and in this video I'm going to be ranking the 2000s. I've done the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at what are, by my estimation, the 15 major fiction releases of the decade from Stephen King. So I will not be including Faithful, the nonfiction baseball book that Stephen King co-wrote with Stuart Onan. I will also not be including On Writing, because while it is a classic, it is nonfiction and serves a completely different purpose. So I will be leaving that one out as well. Recently, or a while back, I guess it has been some time now, I ranked the 90s. And the 90s was an interesting decade for Stephen King. He got sober in the late 80s. He had to sort of find his voice and find his muse again. He took some really interesting stylistic detours in the 90s. For instance, Dolores Claiborne, Gerald's Game. He also gave us a bunch of those, as he said infamously back in the 80s when Christine was published, those big greasy cheeseburgers to digest. I think the 90s includes some of his really strongest work and some of his work that doesn't really hold up that well. And the 2000s is kind of the same. So the very end of the 90s, 1999, Stephen King was hit by a van, his infamous accident. And when I was laying out all the titles that I wanted to talk about from the 2000s, I kind of had a hard time ranking them, not in terms of there was so much high quality material, but because so much of the material of the 2000s just doesn't really rise above or stand out. It's not to say there are no highlights. There are certainly some, as there are in every decade, but it wasn't until I sort of looked at the decade holistically that I realized, along with the 90s, it is, kind of a hit or miss period for Stephen King. Now, I also took the liberty of drafting my list of the 2010s, and in that decade, or the last decade, the 2010s, in my opinion, Stephen King has come roaring back with some of his very best, most inspired work of his entire career. But the 2000s are not without some highlights. There were a number of novels, a few collections. He went back into the infamous trunk and pulled out Blaze, the pre-Carrie novel, and he polished it up and he released that. Very interesting detour. He collaborated again with Peter Straub in a sequel to The Talisman, which to me is an absolute masterpiece. Black House, which I'll talk more about in the video to come. And of course, last but not least, he did finally finish the Dark Tower series, and so that alone makes the 2000s worthwhile. I think if Stephen King had only published books 5, 6, and 7 of the Dark Tower series, and then retired, as he has threatened to do off and on over the past couple of decades, I think his legend would have been secured, and he would still be very famous and worth talking about today. But as with every decade, very prolific, there's a lot to talk about. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So coming in at number 15, at the very bottom of the list, this was not a hard choice for me. As much as I appreciate the format, as much as I appreciate Stephen King releasing a first edition book only in mass market paperback for $6, which was very, very appealing to me and my budget at that time, I have to put The Colorado Kid at the very bottom of the list of the 2000s. I haven't read it since it first came out. My recollection is that it was an intriguing enough mystery that just kind of fizzles out without a resolution. And then in the authors afterwards, Stephen King is almost defensive about this. Like, he realizes, yeah, this isn't great, It's not really complete, but this is what I've got. And sometimes that's how life works. So yeah, I think he even recognized that maybe it just kind of fell short. I get sometimes that books are like that. I think he was writing maybe too hard for the Hard Case Crime imprint. The subsequent Hard Case Crime titles, Joyland and later, I think have been much stronger, but they've also been much more Stephen King and much less like writing to a template that someone else has created. So number 15, The Colorado Kid. Coming in at number 14, I'm going to put From a Buick 8. This is another one that I haven't read since it was first released in the early 2000s. And what I recall is that there's one very, very gripping, very powerful, masterful set piece surrounding opening the trunk of the car, if I'm not mistaken. But everything else just kind of fades away. Even as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, this isn't one of his best. And then when it was over, I had the same thought, like, well, you know, here's hoping that the one that comes out next year is better. Just not super memorable to me. The interesting idea, just not super memorable. So I'm going to put it at number 14. So coming in at number 13, I am going to put Blaze, the trunk novel that Stephen King originally wrote pre-publication of Carrie, and it never got published. And then when he read it back later, he was almost embarrassed by how sentimental, how syrupy, how much it apes John Steinbeck, and so he put it away. It was never published until he found it, or it was presented to him decades later in the 2000s. He went over it, he spruced it up, he polished it up, and he released it as a Richard Bachman novel. There's nothing wrong with Blaze. I actually really enjoyed the book. It's just kind of a modest oddity. It's a oddity in the Stephen King catalog, and just doesn't rise to the level of his best work. So coming in at number 13, Blaze. So coming in at number 12, and I feel kind of bad about this one. I just did the first edition's identification video, and my friend Diana, who I really respect, big Stephen King fan, Doohickey is her absolute favorite. But for some reason, when I was listening to the audiobook, and I just couldn't shake the feeling. The narrator was really good, the setting was really interesting, the characters were okay. I just couldn't help but feel like we've been here before. There was something wheel spinny about Doohickey, and some of Stephen King's really long books have a way of just drawing you into the story. The pages melt away and you just go into this world. Well, Doohickey is a long book that to me felt like a very long book as I was listening to it. I do look forward at some point in the future to going back to it, because like with The Talisman, so many people like the book a lot, and I can't help but feel like maybe I missed something. So at a different point in my life, I'll go back and I'll see what jumps out to me. But for right now, number 12, Doohickey. And at number 11, I'm going to put Lisey's Story. This is one of the last Stephen King books that I actually experienced in my journey through all of his books. I had put it off because I heard that it had more literary aspirations, that it was a little drier, a little bit harder to get into. I think I actually started it when it first came out and then kind of ran out of steam with it. And I did make it through. I did finish it, and it was really interesting, and it had a lot of really interesting things to say about writers, about the families of writers, about obsessive fans of writers, which kind of maybe struck a little too close to home in a few instances. But this was the book, I believe, I should have had my facts straight, but this was the book that Stephen King wrote after receiving the national the National Letters Award was a very controversial decision for him to receive it because he's a popular author and nothing popular can ever be good. But Lisey's story, I feel like, is the book that is most influenced by that idea that Stephen King earned this sort of literary recognition and he needed to live up to it. And I feel like it suffers, it struggles under the weight of that. There's a really cool and really interesting story here, if you just kind of peel away all the literary aspirations or even pretensions of the book. But anyway, not one of my favorites. I respect it. I think it's interesting, but it comes in at number 11. Okay, coming in at number 10. So the 2000s did include the completion of the Dark Tower series. Books 5, 6, and 7, hundreds and hundreds of pages, which Stephen King wrote back to back. And some of it is really great, some of it is really interesting, some of it I think almost betrays the exhaustion that Stephen King must have been feeling going through like that marathon slog of writing those 3 big books back to back. I think book 5, Wolves of the Calla, is probably the strongest. Book 7 gets some brownie points for being the one that actually wraps things up, for better or for worse. And coming in at number 10, I'm going to put book 6, Song of Susanna, as sort of the bridge between the two. It has the, as I recall, I am making my way through the series again, but as I recall, it kind of has the weakest voice and really just serves as maybe a go-between, because so that book 7 wouldn't be quite so damn long. I seem to recall that it's so with the gaps in between writing the books in the series, book 5 has the benefit of sort of picking up after a long gap and starting up and introducing a plot, and book 7 has the benefit of wrapping something up, and book 6 has really neither a strong narrative beginning or strong narrative end. It's just kind of your mid-journey, and we pick it up and then we hand it off at the end. It is the one infamously that Stephen King wrote himself into, which I still remember a lot of people crying foul about that. I've never minded it, and in fact I'm really looking forward to my reread of the series, getting to that content. But anyway, coming in at number 10, Dark Tower 6, Song of Susanna. Coming in at number 9, I didn't quite know what to do with this one because I also covered it in ranking the 80s, but in a lot of ways they are 2 completely different pieces of work. So I went ahead and included the revised and expanded edition of The Gunslinger in the ranking the 2000s, and it comes in at number 9 of 15. The original, like I've said in other videos, pretty much superfluous. Once you have this, the original is, the collector's item, but in terms of actually reading and enjoying the story and getting drawn into the world of the Dark Tower, this is the way to go. So it kind of gets a special honorary mention. I don't know really if it's better or worse than Song of Susanna. I guess if I had to line them all up, you could make the case for The Gunslinger being the weakest or worst book in the series, but the way I was feeling when I made this list, I went ahead and put Gunslinger 1 ahead of Song of Susanna. The 2000s have a couple of books that I had heard, or I had this idea that their reputation was almost universally bad, and these are books that I waited late into my journey through the Stephen King universe to read for the first time. And in both cases, I was pleasantly surprised by how much interesting content, how many unique ideas, how much sheer enjoyment there was in these books. So coming in at number 8, I'm going to put Dreamcatcher. So this is the book that Stephen King wrote longhand, with a pen on paper in the first draft while he was convalescing after his accident, and he was just swarming with painkillers. And I think some of that energy, some of that element is comes through in the work itself. It also has, as far as I can tell, thinking back on it, has the most bodily functions and body related horror of any Stephen King novel, which also no doubt speaks to his convalescence. And when you're pretty much helpless and you have to depend on other people to do everything for you, including bathe you, wipe your butt, help you to the toilet, change your bedpan, change your sheets, whatever, it gives you a pretty unique perspective on life, and that certainly comes through in Dreamcatcher. I saw a lot of kind of EC horror, science fiction, comic elements in it as well. I enjoyed the military as menace theme, which was very reminiscent to me of like the shop in Firestarter. There was just, I didn't have high hopes. Not everything about this is excellent. It definitely has some room for improvement, but it's way better than I was expecting. So I rank it as I do at number 8 on my list, which means that coming in at number 7, I put the other one with a bad reputation that I was nervous about reading and actually quite enjoyed, Cell. So there's parts of Cell that are dated. Of course, it's based on technology. The technology described is now outdated. We've come a long way in the last 20 years, but there are some really strong pieces. The escape from Boston, that whole section of the book, I thought was really powerful and really well done. A lot of very obvious nods to George Romero, to whom the book is actually dedicated. Made me think a lot of the Dead films, especially the ones from the 70s. There was quite a bit of unexpected humor in the book, and then also just a lot of social commentary and a lot of pessimism, which reminded me a lot of Richard Bachman, and which I actually really enjoyed. So this is probably the one that I was expecting to like the least, but ended up liking the most of that group, because it just pleasantly surprised me and defied my expectations. So number 7, Cell. And at 6 and 5, I'm going to put the story collections from the 2000s, both of which I think are really strong and have some really interesting stuff. So I'm going to start with Everything's Eventual, 14 Dark Tales. I'm going to refer to the table of contents. So Autopsy Room 4, one of the, well, I don't know if it's the scariest, but it's certainly one of the most just uncomfortable, tense, suspenseful, almost like being buried alive. And then it has just one of the most memorable, hilarious kind of punchline endings that just came out of nowhere, and I found to be really delightful. Some great stuff in this collection. The Man in the Black Suit, In the Death Room, Everything's Eventual, of course, The Little Sisters of Illyria, the Dark Tower prequel novella got its first mass publication in Everything's Eventual. 1408, which was turned into a really fun movie. Riding the Bullet. There's a lot of good content in Everything's Eventual. So that's why it comes in at number 6 on my list, ranking the 2000s. Following that theme, coming in at number 5, I'm going to put Just After Sunset, the other story collection. I think that this also, it's kind of, they make interesting companion pieces. It's hard to say definitively that one collection is better than the other. They both have really strong, interesting content. So Willa, Stationary Bike, Things They Left Behind, Graduation Afternoon, this is one that you probably don't hear talked about too much. Let's see, Graduation Afternoon. It's all of 8 pages, and it's probably the story in the collection that sticks with me the most. Sometimes the simplest things, the simplest ideas done just the most directly are the best. A Very Tight Place, The Cat from Hell, which is an old story, which was just delightfully grungy and definitely a highlight of this collection. So coming in at number 5, Just After Sunset. Coming in at number 4, I'm going to go back to the Dark Tower series again, and I'm actually going to put book 7 of the Dark Tower series, The Dark Tower, in at number 4. Although in some ways it may be arguably the most important book that Stephen King published in the 2000s, perhaps one of the most important books he published in his entire career. It just, to me, I remember vividly my first journey through it, and I was a little overwhelmed and exhausted because I was reading books 5, 6, and 7 back to back. That may have had something to do with it, but I couldn't help but feel like Stephen King was also exhausted writing books 5, 6, and 7 back to back. And as much as I wanted Roland to get to the flippin' Dark Tower after all that time, there was also something kind of anticlimactic about the idea that, oh, it's a literal, actual place. I so thoroughly enjoyed the adventures that the quartet had along the way. The idea that the Dark Tower is an actual literal thing that they will find at the end of their journey, I don't know if it could possibly live up to the expectations that Roland and Stephen King had set for it over the course of the series. And then, honestly, in the last 50 to 100 pages of this incredibly long 800 and some odd page novel, things just really kind of fall apart in some ways. Without going into too much detail, I just feel like there were some corners cut, some things that were too convenient, almost a little bit ridiculous, like the fate of the Crimson King, for instance. After all this time and all of this build-up across multiple novels where we've heard about this character, just the way he ends up, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous and it's anticlimactic. And of course now the famous ending, the nature of the entire series, I very much respect. I've more than come to terms with it. I'm enjoying my repeat journey through the series and looking forward to the ending again. But the first time around, I was livid. I was so pissed and I felt so cheated that just at the way things ended. It's almost laughable to me now. But there's a lot of good stuff in Dark Tower 7, but I don't know. It's almost impossible to imagine how it could live up to the weight of expectation of everything that had come before. And I totally get, after Stephen King's near-death experience, he just wanted to have the damn thing done. I totally get that, but I just can't help but feel like the tank was just really running on fumes when he got to the end. That might be a controversial opinion, and I very much look forward to revisiting my own opinion and my own prejudices as I make my way back through the series. But as of right now, that's where it stands. So despite all of that, it still comes in at number 4, Dark Tower 7. So for number 3, I'm going to go ahead and put Dark Tower 5, Wolves of the Kala. In terms of, so I'm a big Star Wars nerd as well. So books 1 through 4 of the series are kind of like, I don't know, the original trilogy in a way. And books 5, 6, and 7 are like the prequels, the sequels, I don't know. I see a huge and definitive gap. There's books 1 through 4 is one arc, and then books 5 through 7. And of 5 through 7, definitely I feel the strongest one is Wolves of the Kala. Is the most. It's the last one, in my recollection, where the Katet are truly like they have time. They take time to do a side mission to help other people and grow stronger together in their bond. Book 6 and 7 is very much about protecting all the levels of existence and just getting to the tower, come what may, at all cost. Book 5 reminded me a lot of, and by design, the Magnificent Seven, the Seven Samurai, just a really interesting and sort of compelling idea and a good bridge into that last arc of the series. So in the last 3, the books 5, 6, and 7, to me, book 5 is the strongest, and it comes in at number 3 on my list. Okay, number 2 definitely falls into the big, greasy cheeseburger category. And it's so big and it's so heavy that I may have a hard time holding it up for the entire time that I'm talking about it. But at number 2, I'm going to put Under the Dome. It's always compelling and fascinating to me and exciting when I hear something like Stephen King tried this once when he was a much younger man and it was just beyond his capabilities. And he's gone back to the idea now, and he's finally been able to finish it. I was very, very excited to hear that about Under the Dome. And also, even though it's ridiculous, there's a lot of controversy because the Simpsons movie came out around the same time, and people thought that Stephen King had plagiarized the Simpsons movie, and Stephen King was able to prove, actually, no, I've been working on this concept since the 70s. It was just a coincidence. It does not diminish the impact and the enjoyment of Under the Dome, which is just jam-packed with absolutely abominable, abhorrent characters doing abominable, abhorrent things. Kind of makes me think of Needful Things in a way, because there's that element of social comedy and social commentary, except the people in Under the Dome, by and large, are way worse than anyone in Needful Things. The Big Jim Rennie is just one of the most abhorrent. I can't remember a time when there was a character that I just loathed so much while I was reading or listening to a book, and how many times I fantasized about just twisting his head off and other such violent acts. And then things get more and more desperate Under the Dome, and then at the very end you kind of realize what has actually been going on all along, and you're used to like the street level view down with all the people actually going through all the stuff, and the ending can be, or I found it to be, a bit jarring because it just totally changes the level and the perspective, and I didn't see it coming, and it made sense in retrospect, but it still kind of threw me for a loop. I felt like it was a really interesting twist ending, but it doesn't seem like I've had a whole lot of positive things to say about Under the Dome, but I did still really, really enjoy it. It is Stephen King's 3rd longest published book overall, but it does not feel like it's over 1,000 pages. It just keeps on churning along, and everything, just all the stuff that happens in this book happens over the course of about 7 days. And it has some, of course, some stuff that doesn't rise up in memory, and it has some really, really powerful set pieces, and then just this sense of dread as things just get worse and worse and worse under the dome. And I can recall, like, toward the end, the people inside the dome are just as close to it as they can possibly be, and firemen are spraying like full tilt spraying their fire hoses against the dome, and like little bits of mist are able to come through, and the people on the inside are just trying to breathe the clean air and get the clean moisture that comes through. But it kind of plays like The Stand in microcosm, and in a lot of ways I actually kind of like that approach more, because it's very well defined, this defined space, this defined cast of characters, and I thought that it was really a powerful kind of tour de force, even though it won't win Stephen King any new fans in the previously literary circles. But Stephen King writes for himself and he writes for the fans, and Under the Dome I think was definitely one for the fans, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So it comes in at number 2 of my list of the 2000s. And if you've been keeping track, and I did reference it earlier in the video, then you might know what's coming in at the top of my list for the 2000s. So like I said at the beginning, the 2000s is kind of a mixed bag in terms of Stephen King quality. I feel like the 2010s have been much stronger, and the 2020s are doing just fine. They're well on their way. But there were some real bright spots in the 2000s. And to me, the best novel or piece of fiction that was released in the 2000s that had Stephen King's name on it also had the name of Peter Straub, and that is Black House. So the sequel to The Talisman comes back to Jack Sawyer as an adult, and it's also kind of fascinating to me because so many years had passed in Stephen King and Peter Straub's lives as well. And if The Talisman is about Jack as a young man, it was written by S.K. and Peter Straub when they were also relatively young men. And in the ensuing years, they had both grown tremendously and been able to hone their craft, and the scope of what they were able to attempt, what they were able to achieve, has just grown tremendously as they matured. And I feel like Black House definitely benefits from that. And between The Talisman and Black House, I feel like Black House is the one that truly delivers on the promise of having these two juggernaut authors collaborate on a single piece of work. Whereas The Talisman, I feel like I could see where the seams were, where one did the predominantly wrote and then passed it off, and then they kind of stitched things together with some connective tissue. Black House truly felt like I didn't know where one's voice began, one's voice ended, and they like meshed truly into this brand new voice. And it's gruesome, it's harrowing, it's got some terrible stuff in it, but it is just so compelling as well, and truly represents these two masters at the top of their craft. It also has some really interesting Dark Tower connections. You learn more about the mythos of the Dark Tower, and when you think about where it sort of fits in chronologically with where Stephen King was when he was writing the series, he has said that he learned a lot about where the series needed to go through the process of writing Black House. And Peter Straub, of course, big Stephen King fan, there's elements of Black House that relate to the Dark Tower because Peter Straub wanted to know what certain things were, what they meant, how they worked, so they put it together in their book. So far, I have heard, there's rumor that a Talisman 3 or a Jack Sawyer novel 3 may be on the way based on some ideas that Peter Straub left behind that Stephen King may be able to finish. But as of right now, for the two official releases with these two names under the title, I give Black House the nod in a big way. And it does come in as my number 1 Stephen King book of the 2000s. So I always thoroughly enjoy doing these ranking videos I enjoy just sitting down, making lists, ranking, thinking about where I should put things as well. And I'm always curious to hear your take. What is your number one book of the 2000s? What is your least favorite Stephen King book of the 2000s? Is there something on my list that you would totally disagree with or you would totally do differently? Are you a big fan of The Colorado Kid? If so, please tell me why, because I would love to understand that perspective. But anyway, thank you as always for your time, for your support, and until we meet again, take care of yourselves. I will talk to you later. Bye.